Some debts can only be paid in blood, especially when justice wears a crooked badge. Nika and Bitsui had tracked 2 innocent women across 3 territories, not to harm them, but to save them from a noose they didn't deserve. And now he crouched in the shadows of Redemption Creek, watching identical twins kneel bound in the town square while a corrupt sheriff delivered his twisted ultimatum. The afternoon sun beat down mercilessly on the dusty Main Street, where Dorothea and Louisa Weston faced their final hours. Their hands were bound behind their backs with rough hemp rope that had already chafed their wrists raw, and their identical faces bore the marks of rough treatment during their 3-day captivity. At 24 years old, the twins had built modest lives as seamstresses in the frontier town of Redemption Creek, their nimble fingers creating wedding dresses and Sunday clothes for families who could barely afford such luxuries. They were known for their kindness, their quiet charity, and their refusal to participate in the gossip that fueled most small-town conversations. Sheriff Wade Garrison stood before them like an executioner savoring his final moments of power. At 52, Garrison had transformed from a legitimate lawman into something far more dangerous, a man who discovered that badges could be weapons when wielded without conscience or accountability. His expensive boots and tailored vest spoke of wealth that no honest sheriff's salary could provide, funded by protection money, illegal land seizures, and partnerships with the very outlaws he was supposed to arrest. The town of Redemption Creek had grown around a silver mine that had played out 5 years ago, leaving behind a population too stubborn or too poor to move on. What remained was a community of desperate people clinging to fading hopes. Exactly the kind of place where men like Garrison could thrive. Nikan watched from his concealed position behind the livery stable, his weathered face impassive despite the rage burning in his chest. At 38, he carried himself with the quiet confidence of a man who'd survived countless dangerous situations, through skill and patience rather than reckless bravado. His Navajo heritage showed in his strong features, dark eyes that missed nothing, and the traditional turquoise pendant that hung beneath his worn buckskin shirt. He'd been tracking the Weston twins for 2 weeks, following a trail that had led him through 3 territories and countless dead ends. The story had begun in Canyon de Chelly, where Nikan served as a scout and tracker for the Territorial Marshal Service. His reputation for finding people who didn't want to be found had made him invaluable to law enforcement, though his methods often put him at odds with officials who preferred paperwork to actual justice. 3 weeks ago, Marshal Edward Brennan had summoned Nikan to his office with urgent news. 2 young women had been falsely accused of murdering a prominent rancher named Augustus Blackwood, and bounty hunters were already on their trail with orders to bring them back dead or alive. Blackwood had been a pillar of territorial corruption, a man who'd built his fortune through intimidation, fraud, and strategic violence. His ranch sprawled across land that had been stolen from Navajo families through forged deeds and manufactured debts. Nikan had personal reasons to hate Blackwood. The rancher had been responsible for driving Nikan's extended family from their ancestral grazing lands 10 years earlier, scattering them across the territory and destroying their traditional way of life. When Blackwood turned up dead with a bullet in his back, the territorial authorities had moved quickly to pin the murder on the most convenient targets. The Weston twins had made the fatal mistake of being in the wrong place at the wrong time. They'd been delivering a wedding dress to Blackwood's ranch the evening he was killed, arriving just minutes after the actual murderer had fled the scene. When Blackwood's men found the rancher's body and 2 unfamiliar women nearby, the conclusion seemed obvious despite the complete lack of evidence connecting the twins to the crime. Dorothea and Louisa had been arrested immediately, thrown into a cell without proper legal representation, and scheduled for a hasty trial that was really just a formality before execution. But the twins had managed to escape 3 days before their scheduled hanging, slipping out of their cell through a window that had been left suspiciously unlocked by someone who apparently believed in their innocence. They'd fled into the wilderness with nothing but the clothes on their backs and a desperate hope that they could reach the territorial capital before the bounty hunters caught up with them. That's when Marshal Brennan had assigned Nikan to find them first, to bring them in alive so they could testify about what they'd actually witnessed at Blackwood's ranch. Nikan had found their trail easily enough, his tracking skills honed by years of reading signs that most men would miss entirely. He'd followed them through mountain passes and across desert valleys, always staying just far enough behind to avoid spooking them while keeping close enough to protect them from the various threats hunting them. He'd watched from a distance as they foraged for food, slept in shallow caves, and moved with the desperate determination of women who knew their lives depended on staying free. The twins had made it surprisingly far, considering their lack of wilderness experience. They'd avoided the main trails, stuck to water sources, and generally showed more survival instinct than Nikan had expected from town-bred seamstresses. But 3 days ago, their luck had run out in Redemption Creek. They'd entered the town seeking supplies and shelter, unaware that Sheriff Garrison had already received word of their escape and the substantial bounty being offered for their capture. Garrison had taken them without a fight, surrounding them in the general store with 6 armed deputies before the twins even realized they'd been recognized. The sheriff had thrown them into his jail and sent word to the territorial authorities that he had the fugitives in custody. But instead of arranging for their transport to stand trial, Garrison had decided to handle the situation his own way, publicly and profitably. Now the entire town had gathered in the square to witness what Garrison was calling frontier justice. Merchants had closed their shops, families had brought their children, and the saloon had emptied as everyone came to watch the spectacle. This was entertainment in a place where entertainment was scarce, a break from the grinding monotony of frontier survival. The crowd's mood was ugly, fed by Garrison's carefully crafted narrative about dangerous murderesses who'd killed a respected rancher in cold blood. "Citizens of Redemption Creek," Garrison called out, his voice carrying easily across the assembled crowd. "We are gathered here to witness justice for the murder of Augustus Blackwood, a fine man who contributed greatly to the prosperity of this territory. These 2 women," he gestured dramatically at the kneeling twins, "stand convicted of shooting him in the back like cowards, then fleeing from lawful custody." Dorothea lifted her head, her voice hoarse but steady. "We didn't kill anyone. We were delivering a dress, that's all. We found him already dead and tried to help." Garrison's backhand caught her across the face, snapping her head sideways and drawing blood from her split lip. Louisa cried out, straining against her bonds as she tried to reach her sister. The crowd murmured with a mixture of shock and approval, divided between those who enjoyed the violence and those who were beginning to question whether this was really justice. Nikan's hand moved instinctively toward the rifle strapped to his back, but he forced himself to remain still. Premature action would get the twins killed along with anyone else who got in the way. He needed to wait for the right moment, to understand Garrison's full plan before making his move. Patience had kept him alive through situations far more dangerous than this. And patience would serve him now, as I was saying, Garrison continued, composing himself with theatrical dignity. "These women have been found guilty of murder. The penalty is death by hanging, to be carried out at sunset today. However," he paused for dramatic effect, "I am not without mercy. I'm willing to offer them a choice, one that will demonstrate both justice and compassion." The crowd leaned forward, eager to hear what the sheriff had in mind. Garrison was known for his creative punishments, his way of turning law enforcement into public spectacle that reinforced his authority while entertaining the masses. This promised to be one of his more memorable performances. "Here's what we're going to do," Garrison announced, pacing in front of the kneeling twins like a showman working his audience. "One of these sisters will hang at sunset as punishment for the murder of Augustus Blackwood. The other will go free, released without charges to live the rest of her life as a law-abiding citizen. The choice of which twin lives and which twin dies will be made by them, right here, right now, in front of all of you good people. The crowd erupted in shocked murmurs. This was beyond even Garrison's usual cruelty, forcing innocent women to choose which of them would die. Some people shouted protests while others applauded the twisted brilliance of the punishment. The twins stared at Garrison in horror, understanding that he'd created a situation where any choice they made would destroy them both. "You're insane," Louisa whispered, her voice breaking. "We're sisters, identical twins. How can you ask us to decide which one dies?" "Oh, I'm not asking," Garrison replied with mock gentleness. "I'm telling you. You have until I count to 100 to decide which of you will hang. If you haven't chosen by then, I'll hang both of you and be done with it. The choice is yours, ladies. Choose wisely." Dorothea and Louisa looked at each other with identical expressions of desperate love and anguish. They'd shared everything since birth, finishing each other's sentences and knowing each other's thoughts without words. The idea of surviving while her sister died was unthinkable to each of them, yet Garrison's ultimatum offered no other options. They were trapped in a nightmare with no escape. That's when Nikan made his decision. He'd seen enough of Garrison's sadistic game, understood enough about the situation to know that legal channels wouldn't save these women. The sheriff was operating beyond any law except his own twisted version of frontier justice, and the crowd was too entertained or too intimidated to intervene. If the twins were going to survive, it would require the kind of direct action that Nikan had spent years perfecting. He moved through the shadows behind the buildings, circling around to get closer to the square while staying out of sight. His moccasins made no sound on the dirt, and his dark clothing blended into the lengthening afternoon shadows. Years of tracking and hunting had taught him how to move like smoke, how to be present without being seen. The crowd's attention was focused entirely on Garrison and the twins, giving Nikan the perfect opportunity to position himself. As he moved, Nikan studied the layout of the square with tactical precision. Garrison had positioned himself and his 6 deputies in a loose circle around the twins, their rifles held ready for any trouble. The gallows stood ready nearby, its noose swaying slightly in the hot breeze. The crowd formed a rough semicircle, leaving the area behind the general store relatively clear. Nikan could work with that. He reached a position directly behind where the twins knelt, separated from them by perhaps 30 feet and the bulk of the general store's rear wall. From here, he could see Garrison continuing his count, drawing out each number to maximize the psychological torture. The sheriff was at 53 now, giving the twins less than a minute to make an impossible choice. Nikan notched an arrow to his bow, the weapon he preferred for situations requiring silence and precision. Guns were useful, but they announced your presence and started conversations that often ended in unnecessary bloodshed. An arrow could end a threat before anyone realized danger was present. Buying crucial seconds that meant the difference between success and catastrophic failure. 75, Garrison called out, his voice dripping with false sympathy. Time's running short, ladies. One of you needs to volunteer, or I'll make the choice for you. I'll do it, Dorothea said suddenly, her voice clear despite the tears streaming down her face. Let Louisa go. She's younger. She has more life ahead of her. I'll take the rope. No, Louisa sobbed, shaking her head violently. You're not dying for me. I won't let you. How touching, Garrison sneered. Though I notice neither of you is actually volunteering to save your sister. You're both just offering to die. That's not quite the same thing, is it? That's when Nikan whispered, his voice barely audible but perfectly timed to reach the twins' ears. Breathe. I'll get you both out. Both women's heads snapped up, their eyes searching desperately for the source of the voice. Nikan had positioned himself so they could just barely see him if they looked in exactly the right direction. A shadow among shadows that promised salvation if they could just hold on a little longer. Who said that? Garrison demanded. his showman's confidence cracking slightly as he realized someone was interfering with his carefully staged performance. "Show yourself." Nikan's arrow took the deputy standing nearest to the twins, piercing his shoulder with enough force to spin him around and send his rifle clattering to the ground. The man screamed in pain and surprise, and suddenly the orderly spectacle erupted into chaos as everyone realized the town square had become a battlefield. Chaos erupted across Redemption Creek's town square as Nikan's second arrow found its mark, dropping another deputy before the man could raise his rifle. The crowd scattered in panic, mothers grabbing children and merchants diving behind water troughs while Garrison's remaining 4 deputies struggled to locate their attacker. Nikan had already moved from his previous position, flowing like water through the narrow spaces between buildings, using the panicked civilians as cover while he worked his way closer to the bound twins. Sheriff Garrison's face had transformed from theatrical smugness to genuine rage as he realized his carefully orchestrated performance was falling apart. He drew his pistol and fired 3 wild shots in the general direction of where Nikan's arrows had originated. But the Navajo tracker was already 15 feet from that position, circling around to approach from an unexpected angle. Garrison's bullets punched harmlessly into the general store's wooden siding, sending splinters flying but hitting nothing of value. "Find him," Garrison roared at his remaining deputies, his voice cracking with fury. "Whoever's interfering, I want them dead. And if those twins try to run, shoot them where they kneel." Dorothea and Louisa had frozen in place, their identical faces showing matching expressions of desperate hope mixed with absolute terror. They'd heard Nikan's whispered promise, but had no idea who had spoken or whether salvation was truly coming. For all they knew, this could be another of Garrison's twisted games, designed to give them hope before crushing it completely. But something in that whispered voice had carried conviction, a certainty that suggested their mysterious benefactor knew exactly what he was doing. Nikan had reached the edge of the crowd now, pressed against the side of the blacksmith's shop where the afternoon shadows were deepest. From this angle, he had a clear view of the entire square, including the twins, Garrison, and the 4 remaining deputies who were fanning out in search patterns. The lawmen were competent enough, moving with the practiced efficiency of men who'd handled trouble before. But they were looking for a conventional threat rather than someone who'd been trained by the greatest trackers in the Southwest. The Navajo way of moving through hostile territory emphasized patience and observation over aggression. Nikan's grandfather had taught him that the best warriors were those who understood when not to fight, when to let the enemy's own actions create opportunities for decisive strikes. Garrison's deputies were making noise, calling out to each other and maintaining visual contact like soldiers in enemy territory. That coordination made them predictable, and predictability was something Nikan could exploit. He waited until 2 deputies had moved past his position, their attention focused outward on the surrounding buildings. Then he stepped out behind them with the silence of falling snow, his knife appearing in his hand as if conjured from air. The blade found the first deputy's kidney with surgical precision, dropping the man without a sound. The second deputy started to turn at the slight disturbance behind him, but Nikan's arm had already wrapped around his throat, cutting off air and sound while the man's rifle clattered uselessly to the ground. 10 seconds later, both deputies were unconscious and cable-tied with leather strips Nikan carried for exactly such purposes. He relieved them of their weapons and ammunition, adding the rifles to his own arsenal while checking the loads in their pistols. The odds were improving, but Garrison still had 2 armed men plus his own gun, and the sheriff had positioned himself dangerously close to the twins. Any miscalculation now could result in exactly the outcome Nikan was trying to prevent. The remaining 2 deputies had noticed their partner's disappearance and were calling out with increasing urgency. Garrison himself had backed up against the gallows platform, using it as cover while keeping his pistol trained on the general area where he thought the attack was coming from. The sheriff's tactical instincts were better than Nikan had hoped. suggesting this wasn't the first time Garrison had dealt with serious threats to his authority. "Whoever you are," Garrison called out, his voice carrying across the now mostly empty square, "you're making a fatal mistake. These women are convicted murderers, and interfering with their execution is a hanging offense. Show yourself and surrender, and I'll make sure you get a fair trial." Nikan almost smiled at the absurdity of Garrison offering fair treatment while standing next to a gallows he'd been ready to use on innocent women. The sheriff's definition of fairness apparently involved forced choices between sisters and public executions as entertainment. This was exactly the kind of corrupted authority that had driven Nikan to work with the Territorial Marshal Service in the first place, using his skills to oppose men who wore badges but served only themselves. "The twins are innocent," Nikan called back, his voice coming from a different location than where he'd actually positioned himself. He'd learned years ago how to throw his voice, making it seem to originate from spots he wasn't occupying. Augustus Blackwood was killed by his own partner in a dispute over stolen land. The Weston sisters were convenient scapegoats, nothing more. This information caused visible shock on Garrison's face, confirming what Nikan had suspected. The sheriff knew the twins were innocent but was proceeding with their execution anyway, probably because someone with money and influence wanted them silenced permanently. Blackwood's actual murderer was likely paying Garrison handsomely to ensure the wrong people took the blame. "You're spouting lies told by desperate criminals," Garrison shot back, but his voice lacked conviction. "Even if what you say were true, which it isn't, these women fled lawful custody. That alone deserves punishment." While Garrison was talking, Nikan had been moving again, using the conversation as distraction while he repositioned himself. He was now directly behind the gallows platform, separated from the twins by less than 20 feet of open ground. The two remaining deputies were still searching the wrong area, focused on where Nikan's voice had seemed to come from rather than where he actually was. Another few seconds and he'd have the angle he needed. That's when an unexpected complication emerged from the saloon across the street. 3 men wearing expensive suits and carrying well-maintained rifles stepped into the square with the confident stride of professional gunmen. These weren't local deputies or bounty hunters, they were specialists, the kind of hired killers who commanded premium prices for handling delicate situations. Their presence here meant someone very wealthy wanted the twins dead and had sent insurance to make sure Garrison completed the job. The lead gunman was a man in his 40s with cold blue eyes and a scar running from his left temple to his jaw. He surveyed the chaotic square with professional assessment before speaking to Garrison in a voice that carried clear authority despite its conversational volume. "Sheriff, Mr. Caldwell sent us to ensure his interests are protected. He's grown concerned about your ability to handle this situation efficiently." Garrison's face flushed with anger and embarrassment at the implied criticism. "I have everything under control. Some local troublemaker thought he could interfere, but my men are dealing with it. Your men are lying unconscious behind the blacksmith shop," the scarred gunman replied matter-of-factly. "And you've lost tactical control of this square. Mr. Caldwell's patience is exhausted. We're taking over this execution, and we're doing it now." The mention of Caldwell's name sent ice through Nikan's veins. James Caldwell was one of the most powerful land speculators in the territory, a man who'd built his fortune by acquiring property through any means necessary, legal or otherwise. If Caldwell wanted the twins dead badly enough to send professional killers, it meant they knew something that threatened his empire. The situation had just escalated from local corruption to territorial conspiracy. Nikan's mind raced through revised calculations. 3 professional gunmen plus Garrison and his 2 remaining deputies made for odds that even his considerable skills might not overcome in a direct confrontation. He needed to change the dynamics, create confusion and fear among his enemies while getting the twins to safety. The traditional Navajo approach would be to fade away, regroup, and strike from an unexpected direction. But the twins didn't have time for traditional approaches. Not with Caldwell's killers here to expedite their deaths. The scarred gunman gestured to his companions, who immediately moved to secure the twins. They hauled Dorothea and Louisa to their feet with rough efficiency, dragging them toward the gallows despite the women's desperate struggles. Louisa was crying openly now, her composure finally breaking under the weight of exhausted terror. Dorothea's face had gone pale but determined, her jaw set with the kind of stubborn courage that reminded Nikan of his own sister before she'd been killed by land thieves 10 years ago. "We're not waiting for sunset," the scarred man announced. "These two hang now, together, and we end this farce. Sheriff, you can either assist or get out of the way." Garrison looked like he wanted to protest the usurpation of his authority, but self-preservation won out over pride. He stepped aside, keeping his pistol ready but making no move to interfere with Caldwell's men. The sheriff had apparently decided that staying alive and employed was more important than maintaining control of his own execution. Nikan knew he was out of time. The moment those nooses went around the twins' necks, any rescue attempt would likely result in their deaths, even if he succeeded in killing every man in the square. He needed to act now decisively, and with the kind of audacity that would throw his enemies completely off balance. Sometimes the best tactics weren't subtle, they were shocking. He stepped out from behind the gallows platform into full view. His bow drawn and an arrow nocked, pointed directly at the scarred gunman's chest. The afternoon sun caught the turquoise pendant at his throat, marking him unmistakably as Navajo. His face was calm despite the impossible odds, showing the kind of serene acceptance that came from making peace with death before walking into battle. "Release them," Nikan said quietly, his voice carrying across the silent square with absolute authority. "The twins are under the protection of the Territorial Marshal Service. Harming them is a federal offense that will bring the full weight of the government down on everyone involved." The scarred gunman's eyes narrowed as he assessed this new threat. He didn't seem particularly worried, just calculating how to eliminate Nikan with minimum risk to himself and his partners. "You're bluffing. If the marshals wanted these women protected, they'd have sent a full detail, not one Indian with a bow to test that theory if you want," Nikan replied. "But understand that the moment you move toward those women, my arrow goes through your heart. Your friends might kill me afterward, but you'll be dead before you hit the ground. Is James Caldwell paying you enough to take that certainty?" For the first time, uncertainty flickered across the gunman's face. Professional killers understood risk assessment, and Nikan's absolute calm suggested this wasn't bravado but statement of fact. The distance was less than 30 feet, an easy shot for someone with Nikan's demonstrated accuracy. The gunman would indeed be dead before his companions could respond. "Marcus William," the scarred man said to his partners without taking his eyes off Nikan. "Take positions on his flanks. When I give the signal, we all fire simultaneously." He can't stop all three of us, but Nikan had already anticipated this tactic. As the two gunmen began moving to create crossfire, he did something completely unexpected. He lowered his bow, returned the arrow to his quiver, and raised both hands in apparent surrender. The gesture was so sudden and seemingly irrational that everyone froze in confusion. "You're right," Nikan said with a slight smile. "I can't stop all three of you. But I don't need to. I just need to stop you long enough for my backup to arrive, on cue." The sound of multiple rifles being cocked echoed from the surrounding buildings. The scattered crowd that had seemed to flee in panic earlier had apparently not run as far as everyone assumed. Now windows and doorways around the square revealed armed townspeople, at least 15 of them, with rifles trained on Garrison and Caldwell's men. These weren't professional fighters, but at this range, even amateur shooters could hit their targets. An elderly man with a white beard stepped forward from the general store's entrance, his Spencer rifle steady despite his age. "That's far enough, Garrison. We've tolerated your corruption because we were too scared or too tired to fight. But executing innocent girls for money crosses a line we can't ignore.
Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you.
Those twins came to our town looking for help, and by God, they're going to get it. The old man was Henry Whitmore, owner of the general store and one of Redemption Creek's founding families. If someone like Whitmore was openly defying Garrison's authority, it meant the sheriff's grip on the town had been weaker than anyone realized. The twins' impending execution had apparently served as a catalyst, pushing decent people past their tolerance for injustice. Garrison's face had gone from red to purple with rage. "Whitmore, you old fool, you're threatening a lawman in the performance of his duty. I'll have you arrested for what?" Whitmore interrupted. "Standing up to murder? These girls didn't kill anyone, and everyone in this town knows it. We've all heard the rumors about Blackwood's death, about his partner finding out he'd been skimming profits for years. This whole execution is just Caldwell covering his tracks, and you're helping him do it for money." The revelation hung in the air like gunsmoke. Augustus Blackwood's actual killer was apparently his business partner, James Caldwell, who'd murdered the rancher during a dispute over embezzled funds. The twins had witnessed something at the ranch that day, probably without even realizing its significance. And Caldwell had been systematically eliminating anyone who might connect him to the crime. Nikan used the moment of distraction to move closer to the twins, his hands still raised but his body positioned to shield them from the gunmen. Dorothea and Louisa were staring at him with a mixture of hope and disbelief, struggling to understand how a complete stranger had orchestrated their rescue from certain death. "Who are you?" Dorothea whispered, her voice barely audible over the tense standoff happening around them. "Someone who keeps his promises," Nikan replied softly. "Your father saved my sister's life 15 years ago when raiders attacked our village. He was a cavalry surgeon who treated Navajo wounded when other army doctors refused. I swore to repay that debt if I ever had the opportunity. Today, I'm keeping that promise." The scarred gunman had been calculating odds during this exchange, and apparently decided they'd shifted too far against him. 15 armed townspeople might be amateurs, but they had numbers and positioning. Even if he and his partners managed to kill Nikan and execute the twins, they'd probably die in the resulting firefight. Caldwell didn't pay enough for suicide missions. "This isn't over," he said, backing toward his horse while keeping his rifle trained on the general crowd rather than any specific target. "Mr. Caldwell has a long reach and an excellent memory. Everyone here just made a powerful enemy. Tell Caldwell that the territorial marshals have been investigating his land acquisitions for 6 months," Nikan called out. "Tell him that Augustus Blackwood kept detailed records of every illegal transaction, and those records are now in federal custody. The twins aren't the problem anymore, the evidence is. Killing them won't save him. This was a calculated bluff." Nikan had no idea whether such records existed, but Caldwell didn't know that. The seed of doubt might buy them crucial time while the land speculator tried to determine what evidence might exist and where it could be hidden. Men like Caldwell were often undone by their own paranoia, chasing phantom threats while real ones closed in around them. The 3 gunmen mounted their horses and rode out of town at a gallop, apparently deciding that reporting this disaster to their employer was preferable to dying in Redemption Creek's town square. Garrison watched them go with the expression of a man who suddenly realized he'd bet everything on the wrong horse. The deputies who were still conscious had quietly faded away during the confrontation, abandoning their corrupt sheriff now that his protection was gone. Nikan cut the twins' bonds with his knife, the sharp blade slicing through the hemp rope as easily as thread. Dorothea rubbed her raw wrists while Louisa collapsed against her sister with exhausted relief. They were free, alive, and suddenly aware that their entire world had changed in the span of 20 minutes. "What happens now?" Louisa asked, looking around at the armed townspeople who were slowly lowering their rifles. Caldwell knows we're alive, knows we might have seen something important. He'll send more men, better men. Now we disappear, Nikan replied, already mentally mapping their escape route. The three of us leave Redemption Creek tonight and head for the territorial capital. Marshal Brennan is waiting for your testimony about what you saw at Blackwood's Ranch. Once your statement is recorded and filed with the federal authorities, Caldwell loses his reason to silence you. Henry Whitmore approached with supplies, dried food, water canteens, and a pair of his daughter's riding dresses that would be more practical than the twins' current town clothes. You saved my granddaughter from scarlet fever 5 years ago, he said to Dorothea. Sewed her a doll when she was recovering, made her smile when we thought we'd lose her. I never forgot that kindness. This is me paying back what I owe. As the sun finally touched the western mountains, casting long shadows across Redemption Creek's dusty streets, Nikan prepared the twins for the hard journey ahead. They had perhaps 6 hours before Caldwell's next team of hunters arrived, maybe less if the land speculator decided to handle this personally. The trail to the territorial capital crossed 200 miles of dangerous territory, through lands controlled by various outlaw gangs who sold information to the highest bidder. But Nikan had crossed that territory many times before, knew every hidden trail and safe haven between here and their destination. He'd gotten the twins this far against impossible odds, and he'd get them the rest of the way or die trying. Some debts transcended logic or self-preservation. They became matters of honor that defined who you were when everything else was stripped away. Sheriff Garrison sat in the dust of his ruined authority, watching the town he'd terrorized for 3 years turn against him with casual finality. No one moved to help him up or check his injuries from the scuffle. He'd become invisible, irrelevant, a broken thing that no longer commanded fear or respect. As darkness fell over Redemption Creek, 3 riders left by the northern trail, moving fast toward the distant capital and the promise of real justice. Behind them, the town slowly returned to normal, forever changed by the afternoon when ordinary people found extraordinary courage. The gallows stood empty in the moonlight, a monument to the execution that never happened and the salvation that came from the most unexpected source. The night air carried the scent of juniper and sage as Nikan led the twins through a narrow canyon past 20 miles north of Redemption Creek. They'd been riding hard for 4 hours, pushing their horses to the edge of exhaustion while putting as much distance as possible between themselves and the inevitable pursuit. Dorothea and Louisa had proven themselves capable riders despite their town upbringing, maintaining the punishing pace without complaint, even as fatigue settled into their bones like lead weight. Nikan had chosen this route specifically because it offered natural defensible positions and multiple escape options if they encountered trouble. The canyon walls rose 70 feet on either side, their weathered sandstone surfaces glowing pale silver in the moonlight. Ancient petroglyphs marked the rock faces, symbols left by his ancestors centuries ago when they'd traveled these same paths for trade and ceremony. The land remembered those who respected it and punished those who didn't. They reached a small clearing where a spring bubbled from the canyon wall, creating a pool of clear water surrounded by cottonwood trees. Nikan dismounted and checked their surroundings with practiced efficiency before signaling that it was safe to rest. The horses needed water and the twins needed sleep, even if they could only spare an hour before moving again. Caldwell's hunters would be tracking them by now, probably with Navajo or Apache scouts who could follow a trail that most white men would never see. Dorothea slid from her saddle with visible relief, her legs trembling from hours of gripping the horse's sides. Louisa moved more carefully, favoring her left ankle where she'd twisted it during their desperate flight from the square. Neither woman complained, but Nikan could see the exhaustion etched into their identical faces. They'd been through an ordeal that would have broken stronger people. Yet they maintained a quiet dignity that reminded him powerfully of why his father's debt to their family demanded repayment. "We can't keep running forever," Dorothea said quietly as she knelt beside the spring to splash water on her dusty face. "Even if we reach the territorial capital, what's to stop Caldwell from bribing officials there? He has money, influence, connections throughout the territory. Our word against his won't mean anything." Nikan built a small fire using dried wood that would produce minimal smoke, then arranged stones around it to contain the flames and reduce their visibility from a distance. "Your word alone wouldn't be enough," he agreed, filling the coffee pot with spring water. "But Marshal Brennan has been building a case against Caldwell for 6 months. Land fraud, intimidation of witnesses, conspiracy to commit murder. What he's been missing is direct testimony connecting Caldwell to specific crimes. What you saw at Blackwood's ranch that day provides that connection." Louisa looked up from where she'd been examining her swollen ankle, her face troubled. "But we didn't see Caldwell kill Blackwood. We arrived after he was already dead. All we saw was a man riding away very fast, and the ranch hands acting strangely nervous." "How does that help convict anyone? Tell me exactly what you remember," Nikan said, handing them each a canteen. "Every detail, no matter how insignificant it seems. Sometimes the smallest observations are what crack open entire conspiracies." Dorothea closed her eyes, clearly forcing herself to revisit memories she'd been trying to forget. "We arrived around 4 in the afternoon to deliver Mrs. Blackwood's anniversary dress. We'd spent 3 months on it, hand-stitched lace and silk imported from San Francisco. When we got to the house, the front door was standing open, which seemed odd because of the flies. We called out but nobody answered. Mrs. Blackwood had gone to visit her sister in Denver." Louisa continued, taking up the narrative. "We knew that from gossip in town, so we weren't surprised she wasn't there. But there should have been servants, ranch hands, someone. The place felt wrong, too quiet. We probably should have left right then. We went inside to leave the dress," Dorothea resumed. "Thought we'd hang it in the front parlor with a note. That's when we found Mr. Blackwood lying face down on his office floor. There was blood, so much blood pooling under him. I checked for a pulse, but he was already gone. Probably had been for at least an hour based on how cold he felt." Nikan noticed the clinical precision in Dorothea's description. The kind of observation that came from someone with medical training or natural analytical ability. Most people confronted with a corpse remembered emotion and horror, not specific details about body temperature and blood patterns. This suggested the twins might have seen more than they realized. "What about the man riding away?" he prompted. "Did you see his face, his horse, anything distinctive?" Louisa shook her head. "He was maybe 200 yards distant, heading toward the mountains at a full gallop. All I really saw was a dark coat and a gray horse with white stockings on its front legs. The horse was distinctive though, big gray gelding with an unusual gait. It had some kind of injury to its left front leg that made it move differently than normal horses." This detail sent electricity through Nikan's thoughts. James Caldwell was known throughout the territory for breeding exceptional horses, and his personal mount was a gray gelding that had survived a mountain lion attack 2 years ago. The animal had recovered but retained a distinctive limp that was visible when it moved at speed. If the twins could identify that specific horse, it would place Caldwell at the murder scene. "The ranch hands came running when they heard us scream," Dorothea continued. "But they acted strange, not surprised exactly, more like angry that we were there. They started accusing us of killing him before we could even explain what we'd found. One of them, a big man with a scar on his neck, grabbed Louisa and said we'd hang for this. They locked us in the tack room while they sent for the sheriff. Did you hear them talking among themselves?" Nikan asked. "Any conversation about what had actually happened?" Louisa nodded slowly. "The tack room shared a wall with the stable office. We could hear voices through the boards, not everything but pieces of conversation. The scarred man was telling the others they'd be paid double their usual wages if they stuck to the story. He said Mr. Caldwell had promised to take care of everyone who kept their mouths shut about the boss's visit that afternoon. There it was, the direct connection that would prove conspiracy. The ranch hands had been paid to lie about Caldwell's presence at the scene, and they'd been instructed to blame the twins for a murder they hadn't committed. With this testimony on record, Brennan could arrest Caldwell and leverage the ranch hands into confirming the conspiracy in exchange for reduced sentences. A sound from the canyon entrance interrupted Nicken's thoughts. The soft scrape of boot leather on stone that most people would never notice. He was on his feet with his rifle in hand before the twins even registered the danger, moving to position himself between them and whoever was approaching. His free hand signaled them to silence and stillness, communication that needed no words. 3 figures emerged from the shadows at the canyon's mouth, moving with the careful precision of men who knew they were entering a potential ambush. Nikan recognized their leader immediately, a half-Apache tracker named Vicente Cordero who worked for whoever paid the highest price. Cordero was exceptionally skilled at his trade, capable of following trails across bare rock and through running water. If Caldwell had hired him, the situation had just become significantly more dangerous. Nikan Bitsui, Cordero called out in Apache, his voice carrying clearly across the clearing. James Caldwell offers $20,000 for the twins delivered to him alive. He says you can walk away with half that money if you turn them over now. No questions, no consequences. You've done enough to fulfill whatever obligation brought you into this situation. Take the money and go home. The offer was substantial, more money than most men earned in 5 years of hard labor. Cordero was trying to appeal to practical self-interest, assuming that Nicken's involvement was mercenary rather than personal. The tracker didn't understand that some debts couldn't be satisfied with gold. The twins are under federal protection, Nikan replied in the same language. Take that message back to Caldwell, along with my recommendation that he leave the territory while he still can. Marshal Brennan knows about the conspiracy, knows about the ranch hands who witnessed his visit. The evidence is gathering whether these women testify or not. Cordero laughed, the sound echoing off the canyon walls. Always the righteous warrior, standing against impossible odds for people who forget your name as soon as they're safe. Caldwell has judges and politicians in his pocket throughout 3 territories. Even if your marshal arrests him, he'll be free within a week. All you're doing is delaying the inevitable while making powerful enemies. Then I'll delay it, Nikan said calmly. Every hour these women stay alive is another hour for justice to work. Every day Caldwell spends looking over his shoulder is a day he can't destroy more lives. Some fights are worth fighting, even when you know you'll lose. The tracker sighed with what sounded like genuine regret. You were always too stubborn for your own good, Bitsui. The Apache elders used to say you had the heart of a warrior, but the judgment of a child, never knowing when to walk away from battles that couldn't be won. I'm sorry it has to end this way. Cordero's companions raised their rifles, but Nikan had anticipated the move. He'd already calculated firing angles and cover positions during their conversation, had noted which rocks would deflect bullets and which would shatter. The first shot from Cordero's men went wide as Nikan dove behind a large boulder, returning fire with precision that sent the hunters scrambling for their own cover. "Run!" Nikan shouted to the twins in English. "Follow the stream bed north, stay low, and don't stop until you reach the ruins." "I'll catch up." Dorothea hesitated, clearly unwilling to abandon someone who'd risked everything to save them. But Louisa grabbed her sister's arm and pulled her toward the horses, understanding that Nikan's sacrifice would be meaningless if they didn't take the opportunity he was buying with his life. The twins mounted quickly and urged their horses into the stream, following the water north where their tracks would be harder to follow. Nikan laid down covering fire as they escaped, his bullets forcing Cordero's team to keep their heads down rather than pursuing. He'd positioned himself at a natural choke point where the canyon narrowed, giving him tactical advantage despite being outnumbered. The ancient Navajo warriors who'd left petroglyphs on these walls would have recognized his strategy, using terrain and patience to neutralize superior numbers. "You're only delaying your death," Cordero called out from behind a cottonwood tree. "My men will circle around while I keep you pinned here. In 10 minutes, you'll be surrounded with no escape route. Surrender now and I'll make it quick." But Nikan had no intention of surrendering or dying in this canyon. He'd been in worse situations during his years as a scout, had escaped from ambushes that should have been certain death. The key was never fighting the battle your enemy expected, never following the script they'd written. Cordero assumed Nikan would stay and defend this position, would fight to the last bullet like some glorious last stand from a dime novel. Instead, Nikan waited until Cordero's flanking men had committed to their circling maneuver, then moved in the opposite direction they anticipated. He went up instead of back, scaling the canyon wall using hand and footholds that were invisible unless you knew exactly where to look. His ancestors had carved these climbing routes centuries ago, paths that allowed them to escape from Spanish conquistadors and later from American cavalry. The knowledge had been passed down through generations, part of the survival wisdom that kept the Navajo people alive through centuries of invasion. Within 3 minutes, Nikan had reached the canyon rim 70 feet above where Cordero's men were still searching for him in the darkness below. From this vantage point, he could see their confused movements as they realized their quarry had vanished. Cordero was shouting orders, trying to re-establish control over a situation that had slipped sideways on him. Nikan didn't waste time celebrating his escape. The twins had a 10-minute head start, but they were exhausted and injured while Cordero's team would soon realize their mistake and resume pursuit. He needed to circle around, intercept the twins at the ruins he'd mentioned, and get them to the next safe location before dawn revealed their position to anyone watching from the surrounding high ground. He moved along the canyon rim with the silence of wind through grass, covering ground quickly while leaving minimal sign of his passage. The ruins he'd directed the twins toward were the remains of an ancient Navajo settlement, abandoned centuries ago but still known to those who preserved the old knowledge. The site offered fresh water, defensive positions, and most importantly, hidden passages through the surrounding rock formations that would allow them to continue north without exposing themselves to pursuit. An hour later, Nikan found the twins waiting nervously among the crumbling stone walls of the ancient pueblo. They'd followed his instructions perfectly, staying in the stream to hide their tracks and navigating by moonlight to reach this remote location. Both women looked exhausted beyond measure, but their eyes showed relief when they recognized him emerging from the darkness. "We thought you were dead," Dorothea whispered, her voice breaking slightly. "We heard shooting for several minutes, then silence. Louisa wanted to go back, but I made her keep riding." I'm so sorry we left you." "You did exactly right," Nikan assured them, checking their horses and supplies. "Cordero and his men are still searching the canyon, probably will be until dawn. That gives us maybe 4 hours to put more distance between us before they pick up our trail again. Can you ride?" Both twins nodded, though Louisa's face showed pain when she put weight on her injured ankle. Nikan examined the swelling quickly, determining it was a bad sprain rather than a break. Not ideal for the hard riding ahead, but manageable with proper support. He wrapped it tightly with strips of leather and helped her mount, making sure she could maintain her seat despite the discomfort. They rode through the remainder of the night, following trails that seemed to exist more in Nikan's memory than in physical reality. He led them through passages between towering rock formations, across high mesa tops where the wind erased their tracks almost immediately, and down into hidden valleys where springs fed small oases of green amid the surrounding desert. This was his country, land he knew better than the lines on his own palm, and he used every advantage that knowledge provided. As false dawn began lightening the eastern sky, they reached a location that had been Nikan's destination all along. A small trading post run by a Navajo family who'd known his grandfather, people who could be trusted absolutely to provide shelter without asking dangerous questions. The post was built into the side of a cliff, its adobe walls blending seamlessly with the surrounding stone until you were almost on top of it. An elderly woman emerged as they approached, her weathered face breaking into a smile of recognition when she saw Nikan. She spoke rapidly in Navajo, gesturing them inside while a younger man took care of their exhausted horses. Within minutes, the twins were seated by a warm fire with food and coffee, their immediate needs being tended by people who asked nothing about why they were running or who was chasing them. "We rest here until nightfall," Nikan explained to Dorothea and Louisa. "Then we continue north, using a route that Cordero won't know about. 3 more days of hard travel will bring us to the territorial capital and Marshal Brennan's protection. Can you hold together that long?" Dorothea looked at her sister, some silent communication passing between them as it always did with twins who'd shared everything since birth. Then she turned back to Nikan with determination strengthening her exhausted features. "We'll do whatever it takes. You've risked your life repeatedly to save us from people we've never wronged. The least we can do is be strong enough to finish what you started outside." The sun rose over the desert landscape, revealing a vast expanse of red rock and endless sky. Somewhere behind them, Vicente Cordero and his hunters were still searching for tracks that no longer existed, following a trail that had gone cold in the night. And somewhere ahead, James Caldwell was realizing that his carefully constructed conspiracy was unraveling, that the 2 witnesses he'd tried to silence were still alive and moving steadily toward the one place where his money and influence might not be enough to protect him. The game had changed from simple execution to desperate chase, and the outcome would determine not just whether the twins lived or died, but whether justice could still triumph over corruption in a territory where power had learned to corrupt everything it touched. The territorial capital of Santa Fe rose from the high desert like a promise carved in adobe and stone. Its ancient plaza surrounded by buildings that had witnessed 3 centuries of Spanish, Mexican, and American rule. Nikan guided the exhausted twins through the outskirts as afternoon shadows stretched across dusty streets. 3 days of brutal travel having transformed them from frightened seamstresses into hardened survivors, who moved with the wary efficiency of people who'd learned that death could strike from any direction. They'd lost Cordero's pursuit team somewhere in the Sangre de Cristo Mountains, using a series of false trails and doubling back maneuvers that would have impressed even the Apache scouts who'd taught Nikan his craft. But the victory felt hollow because Nikan knew that reaching Santa Fe was only the beginning of a different kind of danger. James Caldwell's influence extended deeply into the territorial government, and walking into the capital meant entering the heart of his power. Marshal Edward Brennan's office occupied the 2nd floor of a fortified stone building near the plaza, positioned strategically where it could observe the main approaches while offering defensible positions if attacked. The marshal had chosen this location deliberately after an assassination attempt 2 years ago had taught him that federal authority didn't guarantee safety in territories where corruption had taken root like poison oak. A deputy intercepted them at the building's entrance, a young man with sharp eyes who kept one hand near his pistol while evaluating whether they represented threat or legitimate business. Nikan recognized the caution, appreciated it even, because it suggested Brennan was taking security seriously. "Tell the marshal that Nikan Betsui has arrived with the Weston twins," he said quietly.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us now. Back to the story.
"He's expecting us." The deputy's eyes widened slightly at the names, confirming that word of their journey had preceded them. He disappeared up the stairs while a second deputy materialized to watch them with professional vigilance. 5 minutes later, they were being ushered into Brennan's office where the marshal himself stood waiting with an expression that mixed relief and grim determination. Edward Brennan was a man in his mid-50s who'd spent 30 years enforcing federal law in some of the roughest territories in the West. His weathered face bore scars from a dozen confrontations, and his eyes carried the tired wisdom of someone who'd seen too much corruption to harbor illusions about human nature. But those same eyes also reflected an unshakable commitment to justice that had made him legendary among honest lawmen and feared by criminals. "Miss Dorothea, Miss Louisa," Brennan greeted them formally, gesturing to chairs positioned away from the windows. "I'm relieved you've arrived safely." The reports coming out of Redemption Creek suggested that Sheriff Garrison had executed you 3 days ago. Learning you were still alive and en route gave me the first good news I've had in weeks. Dorothea sank into the offered chair with visible relief while Louisa favored her injured ankle, the swelling having worsened despite Nikan's careful ministrations during their flight. Both women looked like they'd aged years in the span of days, their faces bearing the marks of exhaustion and stress that no amount of rest would quickly erase. But their eyes remained alert, focused, showing the mental toughness that had kept them alive through impossible circumstances. "We need to give our testimony immediately," Dorothea said without preamble. "James Caldwell knows we're alive and heading here. He'll be taking steps to discredit us or silence us permanently. Whatever case you're building against him needs our statements on record before he can interfere." Brennan nodded approvingly at her directness. "Caldwell's lawyers filed an injunction this morning trying to prevent me from interviewing you, claiming you're unreliable witnesses with a history of criminal behavior. A territorial judge who happens to owe Caldwell several $1,000s in gambling debts granted a temporary restraining order. I've appealed to the federal circuit court, but that process takes time we may not have, so we can't give our testimony?" Louisa asked, her voice carrying an edge of desperation. "We've ridden for 3 days through country that tried to kill us at every turn. And now you're saying it was for nothing." "I'm saying the legal process is compromised, but not impossible," Brennan corrected gently. "The restraining order only prevents me from taking your official depositions for the criminal case. It says nothing about you providing information for my ongoing investigation into territorial corruption. The distinction is technical but important. Everything you tell me today can't be used directly in court, but it gives me direction for gathering corroborating evidence that can." Nikan had been watching the street through a gap in the curtains, his instincts warning him that they'd reached Santa Fe too easily. Caldwell should have had men watching every approach to the capital, should have intercepted them before they could reach federal protection. The fact that they'd arrived unmolested suggested the land speculator was confident in his ability to neutralize their testimony through legal and political channels. "There's something else you need to know," Nikan said, turning from the window. "The twins didn't just witness the aftermath of Blackwood's murder. They overheard ranch hands discussing payment from Caldwell to maintain a false story. They can identify the horse that fled the scene, a gray gelding with distinctive white stockings and a limp from an old injury. That's Caldwell's personal mount, recognized throughout the territory." This information caused visible excitement in Brennan's expression, the look of a prosecutor who'd just been handed the missing piece of an impossible puzzle. "Can you identify the horse with certainty? Would you be willing to examine Caldwell's stable and pick out the specific animal?" "We could identify it immediately," Dorothea confirmed. "The gait was unusual enough that we discussed it while riding back to town. Louisa has always had an eye for horses, could tell you the bloodline and probable training of any mount just from watching it move. That gray with the injured leg would be impossible to mistake for any other animal." Brennan began pacing, his tactical mind clearly working through implications and strategies. "If we can establish that Caldwell's horse was at the murder scene, and couple that with testimony from the ranch hands about payment for false statements, we have the foundation of a conspiracy case. The problem is getting to those ranch hands before Caldwell silences them permanently. They're already dead, Nikan said flatly, the words dropping into the room like stones into still water. Cordero told me during our confrontation in the canyon. Caldwell had them killed 2 days ago, made it look like a bunkhouse fire that spread too fast for anyone to escape. 7 men burned alive to eliminate witnesses. That's why he's confident about stopping your investigation. The revelation settled over them with the weight of inevitability. Caldwell was systematically destroying evidence, killing anyone who could connect him to Blackwood's murder. The twins represented the last remaining witnesses, and their testimony alone might not be sufficient to convince a jury when facing the legal resources Caldwell could deploy. Then we need something more, Louisa said quietly, her analytical mind working through the problem. Some piece of physical evidence that Caldwell can't destroy or discredit. Something that proves his presence at the ranch beyond any reasonable doubt. Dorothea's eyes suddenly widened with realization. The dress, Mrs. Blackwood's anniversary dress that we delivered that day. We left it in the parlor when we found the body, but in all the confusion, we never thought about it again. That dress had our shop's distinctive stitching pattern, documented in our records with dates and measurements. If it's still at the ranch, it proves we were there exactly when we said we were. And more importantly, Brennan added, catching her reasoning, it establishes the timeline. If you delivered the dress at 4 in the afternoon, and Blackwood had been dead for approximately an hour based on body temperature, that places the murder between 2:30 and 3 o'clock. Caldwell's usual schedule has him in his Santa Fe office during those hours, but several witnesses saw him leave early that day, claiming urgent business. If we can prove he went to Blackwood's ranch instead of where he said he was going. A knock at the door interrupted the marshal's theorizing. The deputy from earlier entered with a telegram in hand, his face troubled. Sir, this just arrived from Redemption Creek. Sheriff Garrison was found dead in his cell this morning. Apparent suicide by hanging. The town council has appointed Henry Whitmore as temporary sheriff and he's requesting federal assistance in maintaining order. The news of Garrison's death didn't surprise Nikan. Men like Caldwell didn't leave loose ends alive. And a corrupt sheriff who'd failed his assignment represented exactly the kind of liability that needed eliminating. The staged suicide would be convincing enough to avoid official investigation while sending a clear message to anyone else who might consider betraying Caldwell's interests. Whitmore is a good man, Dorothea said softly. He stood up for us when no one else would. If Caldwell's people come after him, then Caldwell will have made his first major mistake, Brennan interrupted. Killing a federally appointed temporary sheriff brings in the army, not just marshals. Even Caldwell's political connections can't prevent military intervention in response to assassination of territorial officials. He's getting desperate, taking risks he wouldn't normally consider. Nikan returned to the window, his trained eyes scanning the plaza below where afternoon commerce proceeded with apparent normalcy. Vendors sold produce and pottery. Children played in the dusty square, and businessmen conducted their daily affairs with the casual confidence of people who believed themselves safe in civilization's embrace. But Nikan could see the watchers, men positioned strategically to observe Brennan's office while pretending to conduct legitimate business. We're being monitored, he reported quietly. At least 6 men in positions covering all exits from this building. They're good, professional, not the usual street thugs Caldwell employs for intimidation. He's brought in specialists, probably the same team he used to eliminate the ranch hands. Brennan absorbed this information without visible concern, suggesting he'd anticipated such surveillance. Let them watch. This building is federal property with deputies on every floor. Caldwell's men won't risk a direct assault that would bring down the full weight of government authority. They're waiting for us to move the twins to a less secure location, which we'll have to do eventually, Nikan pointed out. The twins need medical attention, proper food, rest in conditions more comfortable than this office. And if we're going to retrieve that dress from Blackwood's ranch, someone needs to ride out there before Caldwell realizes its significance. I'll go, Louisa volunteered immediately. I know exactly where we left it, could walk straight to the spot even in darkness. And if questions arise about why someone is searching the ranch, I have legitimate reason to want my work back. Absolutely not, Dorothea objected. You can barely walk on that ankle, and Caldwell's people are probably watching the ranch specifically because it's the murder scene. Sending you there is suicide. The sisters' argument was interrupted by the arrival of a woman in her 40s wearing the practical dress of a professional rather than the elaborate fashion preferred by Santa Fe's society ladies. She carried a medical bag and moved with the confident authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. Brennan introduced her as Dr. Sarah Chun, one of the few female physicians practicing in the territory and someone he trusted absolutely. I'm here to examine your injuries and provide whatever treatment you need, Dr. Chun said, without preamble. Her no-nonsense manner immediately putting both twins at ease. The marshal tells me you've had a difficult journey, and I can see he wasn't exaggerating. Let's start with that ankle. While Dr. Chun worked on Louisa's injury, Brennan pulled Nikan aside for a private conversation near the window where they could speak without being overheard. The marshal's weathered face showed concern that went deeper than the immediate crisis. I need you to understand what you've walked into, Nikan. Caldwell isn't just a corrupt land speculator. He's part of a network that extends into the territorial governor's office, the judiciary, even some federal appointments. Taking him down means fighting an entire system that's been built over decades. Systems built on corruption are weaker than they appear, Nikan replied. They depend on everyone maintaining silence, on no one being willing to risk everything for principle. The twins broke that silence when they survived Garrison's execution. Now the question is whether we have the courage to follow through. Brennan smiled grimly. I've been building this case for 2 years, watching Caldwell destroy lives and steal land while hiding behind legal technicalities and political protection. Every time I got close to something actionable, witnesses disappeared or evidence vanished. Having the twins alive and willing to testify gives me the first real chance I've had to bring him down. But it also means painting a target on all of us. The target was already there, Nikan said. Caldwell marked the twins for death the moment they walked into Blackwood's ranch. He marked you when you started investigating his operations. And he marked me when I decided their lives were worth more than his money. Now we either finish what we started, or we spend the rest of our lives running from a man who never forgets and never forgives. Dr. Chun finished her examination and announced that while Louisa's ankle needed rest, it would heal without permanent damage. She'd also treated various cuts and bruises both twins had accumulated during their flight, providing medicines and clean bandages that transformed them from fugitives into patients receiving professional care. The simple act of medical attention seemed to restore something in both women, reminding them that civilization still existed beyond Caldwell's reach. As evening settled over Santa Fe, Brennan outlined his plan for retrieving the dress from Blackwood's ranch. A deputy named Thomas Harrison would ride out tonight under cover of darkness, accompanied by 2 other federal officers. They'd search the ranch house, secure the dress if it still existed, and return before Caldwell's surveillance team realized what was happening. It was risky, but less dangerous than leaving crucial evidence where it could be destroyed. What about us? Dorothea asked. Where do we stay while your deputies are gathering evidence? Here, Brennan replied. This building has sleeping quarters on the 3rd floor, originally designed for witnesses who needed protection during trials. You'll have armed guards outside your door and deputies on every stairway. It's not comfortable, but it's as safe as anywhere in Santa Fe. Nikan wasn't entirely satisfied with this arrangement, but he understood the limitations Brennan faced. Moving the twins through Santa Fe streets to a hotel or safe house would expose them to exactly the kind of ambush Caldwell's watchers were waiting to execute. Better to stay in federal custody where the consequences of attacking them would be clear and immediate. Deputy Harrison departed as full darkness fell, riding out with his companions through a rear exit that Caldwell's surveillance team couldn't observe from their positions in the plaza. Nikan watched them go with mixed feelings, knowing that success or failure in retrieving the dress might determine whether the twins lived to see justice served or died as convenient victims of a conspiracy that had already claimed too many lives. The night stretched long as they waited for Harrison's return. Dorothea and Louisa finally succumbed to exhaustion, sleeping fitfully in the third-floor quarters, while Dr. Chun remained nearby in case medical issues arose. Brennan worked at his desk, preparing legal documents for the case he hoped to build once physical evidence was secured. And Nikan kept watch from the window, his rifle close at hand, studying the darkness for signs of threats that might emerge when guards grew tired and vigilance faltered. Around 3 in the morning, Nikan spotted movement in the plaza that didn't match normal patterns. A group of riders approached from the south, moving with purpose toward Brennan's building. For a moment, tension spiked as he prepared to sound alarm, but then he recognized Deputy Harrison in the lead. The riders weren't attackers, but the returning federal officers. And Harrison carried a wrapped bundle that could only be the anniversary dress. "We found it exactly where the twins said it would be," Harrison reported minutes later, carefully unwrapping the dress on Brennan's desk. Hidden under other clothing in the parlor wardrobe, probably overlooked during initial investigations because it looked like it belonged there. The stitching is remarkable, definitely distinctive enough to serve as identification. The dress was indeed beautiful, ivory silk with hand-stitched lace that had taken months of painstaking work to create. But more importantly, it bore the kind of unique craftsmanship that could be definitively connected to the twins. Shop through documented records and testimony from other customers who'd commissioned similar work. Physical evidence that corroborated their account of being at the ranch on the day of the murder. "There's something else," Harrison continued, producing a small leather-bound book. "I found Blackwood's personal journal in his office safe. Apparently he'd been documenting his partnership with Caldwell, probably as insurance in case Caldwell tried to cut him out or silence him. The entries detail every illegal land acquisition, every bribe paid to officials, every intimidation campaign conducted over the past 5 years." Brennan handled the journal like it was made of spun gold, carefully turning pages that contained enough evidence to destroy not just Caldwell, but his entire network of corruption. This was beyond anything the marshal had hoped to find. A complete roadmap of criminal conspiracy written in the victim's own hand. With this journal and the twins' testimony about Caldwell's horse at the murder scene, the case became not just viable but overwhelming. "Caldwell is finished," Brennan said with quiet satisfaction. "Even his political connections can't protect him from this level of documented evidence. I'll present this to the Federal Circuit Court in the morning. Request immediate arrest warrants not just for Caldwell, but for every official named in these pages as accepting bribes." But Nikan wasn't celebrating yet. He'd seen too many cases collapse at the moment of apparent victory, had learned that powerful men didn't surrender easily when facing ruin. Caldwell would know by morning that his journal was missing, would understand that his carefully constructed empire was crumbling. Desperate men took desperate actions, and a cornered predator was the most dangerous animal in any wilderness. "Double the guards," Nikan advised. "Caldwell will strike before you can present that evidence to any court. Tonight if possible, tomorrow morning at latest. He has nothing left to lose and everything to gain by eliminating the witnesses and destroying the journal." Even as Nikan spoke, new movement in the plaza below caught his attention. More riders arriving, perhaps 20 men converging on Brennan's building from multiple directions. These weren't watchers or casual observers. They were armed men preparing for assault. Caldwell had apparently decided that legal maneuvering wouldn't save him, that his only option was direct action regardless of consequences. Get the twins to the basement. Nikan ordered, his voice carrying the authority of someone who'd commanded men in combat. "Brennan, send runners to the army garrison requesting immediate assistance. Everyone else, prepare to defend this building like your lives depend on it. Because in about 5 minutes, they absolutely will." The first gunshot shattered the pre-dawn silence like breaking glass, followed immediately by a volley that sent splinters flying from the federal building's heavy wooden shutters. Nikan had already moved the twins into the reinforced basement, where territorial records were stored in fireproof vaults, the thick adobe walls providing better protection than anywhere else in the structure. Dorothea and Louisa huddled behind stacks of legal documents while Dr. Chun checked their weapons with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd treated enough gunshot wounds to understand their necessity. Marshal Brennan had positioned his 8 deputies at strategic windows throughout the building, each man armed with multiple rifles and enough ammunition to sustain prolonged engagement. The federal building had been constructed specifically to withstand assault, its walls 2 feet thick and its windows positioned to provide overlapping fields of fire. But 20 attackers with determination and professional training could overwhelm even the best defensive positions if given enough time. Nikan took position at the second-floor corner window that offered the widest view of the plaza, his rifle loaded and 3 more weapons within easy reach. Through the pre-dawn darkness, he could see Caldwell's men spreading out in a tactical formation that spoke of military experience. These weren't common hired guns or desperate outlaws. They were veterans who understood siege warfare and knew how to reduce fortified positions through systematic application of force. They're setting up for a coordinated assault. Nikan called down to Brennan. 2 teams on the flanks to suppress our fire while the main group rushes the entrance. Classic cavalry tactic adapted for urban fighting. They'll try to breach the front door with explosives, then flood the building before we can reposition. Brennan absorbed this analysis without panic, his years of frontier law enforcement having prepared him for situations where legal authority became secondary to immediate survival. "How long before the army garrison responds to our runners?" he asked Deputy Harrison, who'd returned from sending urgent messages to the military authorities. 30 minutes minimum," Harrison replied grimly. "They need time to muster troops and cross the city. We're on our own until then." The second volley of gunfire was more organized, bullets striking specific windows in patterns designed to identify which positions were manned and which were vulnerable. Caldwell's assault leader was probing their defenses, gathering intelligence before committing to full attack. Nikan held his fire, unwilling to reveal his position until targets presented themselves clearly enough to justify wasting ammunition. A shout from the plaza announced the assault's commencement as 6 men rushed the front entrance, carrying what appeared to be a heavy beam wrapped in cloth soaked with lamp oil. They intended to ram the door while simultaneously setting it ablaze, creating chaos and opening a path for the main force. Nikan's rifle spoke once, dropping the lead man with a shot that would have impressed the Apache warriors who'd trained him. The remaining 5 faltered but continued their charge, driven by whatever promises or threats Caldwell had used to secure their loyalty. Brennan's deputies opened fire from multiple windows, their coordinated volleys cutting down 3 more attackers before the makeshift battering ram even reached the door. The surviving 2 men dropped their burden and retreated under covering fire from their companions, leaving the oil-soaked beams smoldering in the street. First assault repelled, but Nikan knew this was merely the opening move in a longer game. "Caldwell himself is out there," Dorothea called from the basement stairs, her voice carrying urgency. "I saw him through the basement window directing his men. He's personally commanding this attack." This information transformed Nikan's tactical assessment. If Caldwell was present, it meant the land speculator had moved beyond hiring proxies and decided to handle this crisis personally. Desperation had overcome his usual caution, driving him to risk direct involvement in what amounted to open warfare against federal authority. Men in that state of mind became unpredictable, capable of actions that defied rational calculation. The next assault came from an unexpected direction as gunfire erupted from the building directly across the plaza. Caldwell had positioned snipers in the general store's second floor, giving them elevated positions that overlooked the federal building's roof and upper windows. Bullets began striking around Nikan's position with uncomfortable accuracy, forcing him to relocate to avoid being pinned down by superior positioning. "They're getting smarter," Deputy Harrison observed, moving between windows to return fire at the snipers. "Caldwell's commander knows what he's doing. This isn't just a mob attack, it's a proper military assault." Nikan worked his way to the building's rear, checking sight lines and evaluating whether Caldwell's forces had completely surrounded them or left gaps in their perimeter. What he saw confirmed his worst fears. 8 more men were positioned behind the building, blocking any potential escape route while waiting to intercept anyone foolish enough to attempt retreat. They were thoroughly besieged with dwindling ammunition and no immediate prospect of relief. A new sound cut through the gunfire, the distinctive crack of a Sharps buffalo rifle firing from somewhere in the surrounding buildings. The heavy bullet punched through one of the general store's windows and sent a sniper tumbling backward with catastrophic force. Another shot followed seconds later, dropping a second sniper and throwing Caldwell's assault into momentary confusion. "Someone's shooting at Caldwell's men from the church bell tower," Deputy Harrison reported with surprise. "Can't see who, but they're using a weapon that could drop a buffalo at 500 yards. 2 of Caldwell's snipers are already down." Nikan felt grim satisfaction at this development. Santa Fe wasn't entirely under Caldwell's control despite his political influence and financial power. Someone in the city possessed both the courage and skill to intervene in what appeared to be a one-sided massacre, buying crucial time for the defenders while evening odds that had been stacked heavily against survival. The buffalo rifle continued its methodical work, each shot carefully placed to maximum effect. A third sniper fell, then a fourth, until Caldwell's remaining marksmen abandoned their elevated positions rather than face an invisible enemy who killed with mechanical precision. The assault commander could be heard shouting orders, trying to reorganize his forces in the face of this unexpected complication. "It's Father Domingo, Doctor," Chun announced, having moved to a window with a view of the church. "The old priest who runs San Miguel Chapel. He's the one shooting from the bell tower. I'd recognize that ancient Sharps rifle anywhere. Been in his family for 3 generations." The revelation that a Catholic priest was participating in the gun battle added surreal dimensions to an already desperate situation. But Nikan understood that frontier clergy often possess skills beyond spiritual counseling, having survived decades in territories where violence was common and moral certainty sometimes required practical application. Father Domingo apparently believed that defending innocents from murderous assault fell within his religious obligations. Caldwell's assault commander adjusted tactics again, pulling his men back to safer distances while preparing what appeared to be a final overwhelming rush. They'd lost at least 8 men to the defenders' rifles and Father Domingo's sniper fire, but they still maintained numerical superiority and could afford to trade casualties for victory. The next attack would likely succeed through sheer weight of numbers unless something changed the fundamental dynamics. That change arrived in the form of hoofbeats from the direction of the army garrison as cavalry troopers poured into the plaza at full gallop. Captain Marcus Reynolds led the column, his drawn saber catching the first rays of dawn as he positioned his 40 soldiers between Caldwell's attackers and their objective. The captain's voice carried clearly across the plaza as he delivered an ultimatum that brooked no negotiation. By authority of the United States Army, all persons engaged in assault upon federal property are ordered to surrender immediately. Drop your weapons and lie face down in the street. Anyone who resists will be shot without further warning. For a moment, The outcome hung in balance as Caldwell's assault commander weighed options that had suddenly become much less favorable. Fighting federal marshals was one thing, but engaging army troops in open combat meant crossing lines that would bring consequences even Caldwell's political connections couldn't mitigate. The commander apparently decided that whatever payment he'd received wasn't worth facing military justice. "Stand down," he ordered his men. "Drop weapons and comply." But James Caldwell himself had different ideas about surrender. The land speculator emerged from his covered position with a pistol in each hand, his face twisted with rage that had burned away any remaining rationality. He began firing wildly at the federal building, screaming accusations and threats that revealed the depth of his desperation. This was a man watching his empire collapse, seeing decades of carefully accumulated power disintegrating in a single morning. "You think you've won?" Caldwell shrieked, his voice cracking with fury. "You think destroying me changes anything? I built this territory, made it profitable when it was nothing but desert and savages. Without me, everything collapses." Captain Reynolds moved to intercept Caldwell, but the land speculator had already shifted his aim toward the basement windows where he'd apparently spotted the twins through a gap in the shutters. His intent was clear. If he couldn't escape justice, he'd at least eliminate the witnesses who'd brought him down. 2 shots rang out, both striking the adobe wall inches from where Dorothea was visible. Niken's rifle barked once from his second floor position, the bullet taking Caldwell in the right shoulder and spinning him around before he could fire again. The land speculator dropped both pistols and fell to his knees, clutching his wounded arm while blood seeped between his fingers. Around him, his remaining men were surrendering to Captain Reynolds' troopers, throwing down weapons and raising hands in gestures of submission. "Secure the prisoners," Reynolds ordered his sergeants. "I want every man involved in this assault identified and charged with attacking federal property. And someone get a doctor for Caldwell before he bleeds out. He needs to survive long enough to stand trial." The siege was over, ended as abruptly as it had begun. Niken lowered his rifle and took inventory of their situation with practiced efficiency. No deputies had been killed, though several bore minor injuries from flying splinters and ricochets. The building itself had sustained considerable damage, but remained structurally sound. And most importantly, the twins were alive and safe, protected by men who'd risked everything to uphold justice in a territory where justice had become a rare commodity. Marshal Brennan emerged from the building with Blackwood's journal in hand, presenting it to Captain Reynolds as evidence of the conspiracy that had necessitated the assault. The cavalry officer's face grew progressively darker as he scanned entries that documented bribes to military officers, illegal land seizures from Army veterans, and systematic corruption of territorial governance. This wasn't just a criminal case anymore. It had become a military matter involving betrayal of federal authority. "I'm placing James Caldwell under military arrest pending transfer to federal custody," Reynolds announced. "These documents detail crimes that fall under military jurisdiction as well as civilian law. He'll face courts-martial for bribing Army officers in addition to whatever charges Marshal Brennan files." Dorothea and Louisa climbed cautiously from the basement, blinking in the morning sunlight that now flooded the plaza. Both women looked stunned by the violence they'd witnessed, the casual brutality of men willing to kill to protect corrupt power. But beneath the shock, Niken could see steel forming in their spines, the kind of tempered strength that emerged from surviving situations that should have destroyed weaker souls. "Is it really over?" Louisa asked quietly, watching as troopers secured Caldwell and his captured men. "After everything we've been through, can we finally stop running?" "The immediate threat is ended," Brennan replied carefully. "Caldwell will stand trial. His co-conspirators will be arrested based on evidence in Blackwood's journal, and the territorial government will undergo significant reforms. But corruption doesn't die easily, and the networks Caldwell built over decades won't disappear overnight." Niken understood what Brennan wasn't saying directly. While Caldwell himself was finished, the systems that had enabled his rise to power remained largely intact. Other ambitious men would emerge to fill the vacuum, bringing their own versions of corruption and abuse. The twins had won their immediate battle for survival, but the larger war for territorial justice would continue long after today's violence. Faded into history, Father Domingo descended from his church bell tower carrying his ancient Sharp's rifle with the casual familiarity of someone who'd used weapons since childhood. The elderly priest offered no apologies for his intervention, merely nodding to Brennan and Nikan, before returning to his chapel where morning mass would proceed as scheduled, despite the bodies being removed from the plaza. Faith and violence had coexisted on the frontier for centuries, sometimes in uncomfortable proximity. Dr. Chun was treating Caldwell's shoulder wound with professional detachment, providing care because medical ethics demanded it, rather than any sympathy for the patient. The land speculator had lapsed into sullen silence, apparently recognizing that his earlier threats and bluster had accomplished nothing except ensuring harsher punishment. Men like Caldwell often became surprisingly meek once their power evaporated. "What happens to us now?" Dorothea asked Marshal Brennan. "Our shop in Redemption Creek is probably destroyed, our reputation tarnished by false murder charges. Even if we're officially cleared, rebuilding our lives seems impossible." Brennan glanced at Captain Reynolds, some silent communication passing between the two federal officers. "The territorial government will provide compensation for wrongful prosecution and property losses. It won't restore everything you've lost, but it should give you enough resources to start fresh somewhere else. Additionally, your testimony in the upcoming trials will be valuable enough that witness protection funds can assist with relocation expenses." "I have a suggestion," Nikan interjected, speaking for the first time since the siege ended. "The Navajo Nation is establishing new trading posts along the territorial borders, places where our people can conduct business with settlers on equal terms. Skilled seamstresses would be welcome there, especially ones with reputations for fair dealing and quality work. It's not the life you planned, but it offers honest opportunities." The twins exchanged glances, that silent twin communication that needed no words to convey complete thoughts. Something in Nikan's offer appealed to them. Perhaps the chance to start over in a place where their past wouldn't define their future, where they could build new reputations based on current actions rather than fighting shadows of false accusations. "We'll consider it," Dorothea said finally. "First we need to testify, help ensure that Caldwell and everyone involved in this conspiracy faces justice. Then we can think about what comes after." The plaza was filling with curious citizens drawn by news of the gun battle and Caldwell's arrest. People who'd lived under his corrupt influence for years now witnessed his downfall with expressions ranging from satisfaction to disbelief. Some had prospered through connections to Caldwell's network and would mourn his passing. Others had suffered under his rule and would celebrate finally being free from his shadow. As morning sunlight strengthened across Santa Fe's ancient plaza, Nikan felt the weight of completed obligation settling across his shoulders. He'd repaid his family's debt to the twins' father, kept his promise to see them safely to federal protection. The impossible task that had begun in Redemption Creek's town square had somehow succeeded despite odds that should have guaranteed failure. Sometimes honor and skill were enough to overcome superior force and political corruption. But Nikan also understood that this victory came with costs that would ripple through many lives. The deputies who defended the federal building would face retaliation from Caldwell's allies. Father Domingo's intervention would create tensions with church authorities. And the twins themselves would spend years recovering from trauma that no amount of compensation could fully address. Justice had been served, but justice was never as clean or simple as the story suggested. Marshal Brennan approached with documents requiring Nikan's signature, official statements and witness testimonies that would become part of the legal proceedings against Caldwell and his network. The paperwork felt anticlimactic after the life or death struggles of the past days, but Nikan recognized its importance. Civilized society ran on documented evidence and legal procedures, not just on courage and rifle shots. "The territorial governor wants to meet with you," Brennan mentioned while Nikan signed papers. "Officially to thank you for your service, unofficially to assess whether you'll be a problem for his administration." The governor was one of Caldwell's political allies, though apparently not involved in the criminal conspiracy. He's trying to determine how much of his own corruption might be exposed by ongoing investigations. "Tell him I have no interest in territorial politics," Nikan replied. "My obligation was to 2 innocent women who deserved protection. That obligation is fulfilled. Whatever else happens in Santa Fe's government is your concern, not mine." But even as Nikan spoke, he knew he was lying to himself. The past days had revealed depths of corruption that infected every level of territorial authority. Walking away meant abandoning the fight only partially won, allowing new versions of Caldwell to emerge from the wreckage. Perhaps his obligation extended beyond individual debts to encompass the broader struggle for justice in territories where power had learned to corrupt absolutely. The twins were being escorted to more comfortable quarters in the army garrison, where they'd remain under military protection until trial proceedings began. Both women looked back at Nikan with gratitude that transcended words. Recognition that this quiet Navajo tracker had saved their lives repeatedly through a combination of skill, courage, and stubborn refusal to accept defeat. Whatever happened next, they'd survived together when survival should have been impossible. As the plaza returned to normal morning routines, merchants opening shops and vendors setting up stalls as if armed siege was just another frontier inconvenience, Nikan retrieved his horse from the stable where it had been cared for during the night's violence. The animal nickered softly at his approach, ready to continue whatever journey lay ahead. And Nikan had to decide whether that journey led back to Canyon de Chelly and the quiet life of a scout, or forward into deeper involvement with the territorial struggle against corruption. The choice weighed on him as he checked his weapons and supplies, preparing for departure even though he hadn't yet decided on a destination. Sometimes the right path only became clear through movement rather than contemplation. Sometimes you had to start riding before knowing where the trail would lead. 3 months had passed since the siege of the federal building transformed Santa Fe's political landscape like a flash, flood reshaping desert canyons. Nikan stood in the doorway of a newly constructed trading post on the northern edge of Navajo territory, watching autumn clouds gather over distant mountains while contemplating how profoundly those violent days had altered the trajectories of everyone involved. The trading post bore a hand-carved sign reading Twin Sisters Mercantile in both English and Navajo script, testament to the new life Dorothea and Louisa had built from the ashes of their destroyed past. The twins had testified at 14 separate trials over the course of 8 weeks, their clear and consistent accounts helping to convict not just James Caldwell, but 23 territorial officials who'd participated in his corruption network. Caldwell himself had received a life sentence in federal prison, his vast fortune seized to compensate victims of his illegal land schemes. The trials had become territorial sensation, drawing journalists from as far as San Francisco and New York who recognized the story's significance as a test of whether justice could survive in regions where power had learned to operate beyond legal constraints. The proceedings had exposed corruption that reached into every level of territorial government, forcing resignations and reforms that would reshape frontier governance for decades to come. Marshal Edward Brennan had been promoted to Territorial Chief Marshal, given expanded authority and resources to continue rooting out corruption that had infected territorial governance for decades. His first major action had been establishing a network of federal outposts throughout remote regions, ensuring that settlers and indigenous peoples alike had access to legitimate law enforcement, rather than relying on corrupt local sheriffs. The changes weren't universally popular among those who'd profited from the old system, but they represented genuine progress toward the kind of ordered society that territories needed to achieve statehood. Captain Marcus Reynolds had received commendation for his rapid response during the siege, though military investigators had subsequently uncovered evidence that several officers in his garrison had been accepting bribes from Caldwell. Reynolds had personally testified against his own subordinates, choosing institutional integrity over professional loyalty. The Army had since implemented new oversight procedures designed to prevent similar corruption in future territorial assignments. Father Domingo had faced ecclesiastical review for his violent intervention during the siege, with some church authorities questioning whether a priest should engage in lethal combat, regardless of circumstances. But the territorial bishop had ultimately supported the elderly priest's actions, ruling that defending innocent life from imminent murder fell within acceptable boundaries of moral theology. Sheriff Henry Whitmore had transformed Redemption Creek from Garrison's private kingdom into a model of frontier governance, working with federal marshals to investigate remaining corruption while rebuilding community trust and legal authority. The town had erected a monument in the plaza where the twins had nearly been executed. A simple stone marker bearing the inscription, "Justice delayed is not justice denied," along with the dates of their ordeal. Whitmore had invited the twins to the dedication ceremony, but neither woman had felt ready to return to the place where they'd faced death. The trading post had exceeded even Nikan's optimistic projections, becoming a hub where Navajo artisans sold pottery, weavings, and silverwork while settlers purchased supplies and equipment for their homesteads. The twins had brought their seamstress skills to the enterprise, creating custom clothing that blended Navajo designs with settler fashion in ways that appealed to both communities. Their work had attracted customers from hundreds of miles away, people who valued quality craftsmanship and the story of courage behind the women creating it. What had begun as a simple business venture had evolved into something more significant, a bridge between cultures that had historically viewed each other with suspicion and hostility. Dorothea emerged from the trading post carrying ledgers that documented the month's transactions, her face showing satisfaction at numbers that confirmed the business's viability. She'd gained weight since escaping Caldwell's persecution, her features no longer showing the gaunt exhaustion that had marked her during their flight. But her eyes retained alertness that suggested she'd never entirely lose the wariness developed during those days when death shadowed every moment. She'd learned lessons about human nature and institutional corruption that no amount of peaceful prosperity could completely erase. "We made a profit again this month," she announced, settling into the chair beside Nikan while reviewing figures with practiced efficiency. "Enough to repay another portion of the territorial compensation we received. Louisa believes we'll be completely self-sufficient within 6 months. No longer dependent on government assistance for our survival. The compensation was rightfully yours," Nikan replied, watching a hawk circle overhead in lazy patterns that suggested good hunting in the valleys below. "Payment for injustice that can't be fully measured in money. You shouldn't feel obligated to repay it." "We know," Dorothea said quietly, her voice carrying conviction that came from hard-won understanding. "But accepting money feels like admitting we're victims, that what happened to us defines who we are. Repaying it, building something successful through our own efforts, proves we're more than just the women who survived Caldwell's conspiracy. We're establishing identity beyond our trauma." Louisa appeared from the storage building behind the main structure, her limp barely noticeable now after months of healing and the supportive boot that Dr. Sarah Chun had designed specifically for her injured ankle. She carried bolts of fabric recently delivered from Denver, materials that would become the elaborate garments wealthy settlers commissioned for special occasions. The twins had developed reputation for transforming ordinary cloth into extraordinary, fashioned through patient craftsmanship that honored both utility and beauty. Behind her, a young Navajo apprentice carried additional supplies. One of several local women, the twins had trained in advanced sewing techniques. Marshal Brennan sent a telegram, Louisa announced, handing the message to Nikan with an expression that suggested she already knew its contents and had opinions about how he should respond. He wants to know if you're interested in permanent appointment as federal deputy, marshal specializing in tracking and witness protection. Says your work protecting us demonstrated exactly the kind of skills and judgment he needs for his reformed marshal service. Nikan read the telegram twice, weighing an offer that would fundamentally change his relationship with territorial authority. He'd spent years working as independent contractor, maintaining freedom to accept or decline assignments based on personal judgment. Becoming permanent deputy would mean accepting institutional obligations, following orders even when he disagreed with their wisdom. But it would also provide resources and authority to help people facing situations similar to what the twins had endured. The decision carried weight that extended far beyond simple career choice. What do you think? He asked the twins, valuing their perspective after everything they'd experienced together. You've seen how territorial justice works at its worst and occasionally at its best. Is it worth dedicating my life to making the system function properly? Dorothea and Louisa exchanged that silent twin communication that needed no words to convey complete thoughts before. Dorothea spoke for both. 3 months ago, we believed justice was something that only existed in stories, that real life rewarded power and punished weakness regardless of innocence. You showed us we were wrong, that individual courage combined with institutional support can overcome even entrenched corruption. If you accept Brennan's offer, you'll give that gift to others who desperately need it. But it will change you, Louisa added softly, her analytical mind recognizing complications that enthusiasm might overlook. Working within systems means compromising with their limitations, accepting partial victories when complete justice isn't achievable. You'll save some people and fail to save others, and the failures will haunt you more than the successes satisfy you. That's the cost of choosing this path. Her words carried wisdom beyond her years, understanding gained through intimate experience with how imperfect justice functioned in practice rather than theory. Nikan appreciated her honesty, her refusal to pretend that righteous choices came without painful consequences. The frontier had no room for comfortable illusions about the prices that honor demanded from those who chose to serve it. A rider approached from the south, raising dust that marked his passage across the high desert landscape. Nikan's hand moved instinctively toward his rifle before recognizing Deputy Thomas Harrison, the young federal officer who'd helped retrieve the dress from Blackwood's ranch during their desperate race to gather evidence. Harrison looked travel-worn and urgent, suggesting this wasn't a social visit, but rather the beginning of another crisis requiring immediate attention. Nikan, thank God you're here, Harrison said, dismounting quickly and accepting the water canteen Louisa offered. Brennan sent me to find you. There's a situation developing in the mining camps near Silver City. A company owner is forcing miners to work unsafe conditions, and when families complained, he had several men arrested on fabricated charges. Their wives and children came to Santa Fe begging for help. But local authorities refused to intervene because the mine owner has political connections. The scenario was depressingly familiar. Another powerful man abusing authority to exploit vulnerable people who lacked resources to defend themselves. The kind of situation that would continue repeating endlessly unless someone intervened to demonstrate that power had limits even in remote territories. Nikan felt the weight of moral obligation settling across his shoulders like a familiar burden that he'd somehow known he couldn't avoid forever. How many miners are imprisoned? He asked, already mentally preparing for another dangerous assignment that would test both his skills and his commitment to the principles he'd fought to uphold. 15 men held in the company jail on charges of inciting riot and destruction of property. The mine owner is threatening to ship them to territorial prison unless their families sign contracts selling their land claims to his company. It's extortion disguised as legal process. And it's happening right now while we waste time talking. Dorothea stood up abruptly, her face showing determination that reminded Nikan powerfully of the moment. She'd volunteered to hang in her sister's place, back in Redemption Creek's dusty square. We're coming with you. Our testimony helped dismantle Caldwell's conspiracy because we'd lived through similar circumstances. These mining families need witnesses who'll validate their experiences, who'll testify that they're not exaggerating or fabricating complaints. Absolutely not, Nikan objected immediately, his protective instincts overriding tactical considerations. You've done enough, risked enough. This isn't your fight. That's exactly what people told us in Redemption Creek, Louisa countered with quiet firmness. That standing up to Garrison wasn't worth the risk, that we should accept injustice quietly rather than fighting for what was right. We learned better through painful experience. These mining families are learning the same lessons we did, and we can help them understand they're not alone. Harrison looked uncomfortable with the twins volunteering, clearly preferring to keep civilians away from potentially violent confrontations. But Nikan recognized the strategic value they offered beyond their courage. The territorial press had made the twins famous as symbols of ordinary people overcoming corrupt power. Their presence at Silver City would attract journalistic attention that might protect the miners better than any number of federal deputies carrying legal warrants. If you come, you follow my instructions exactly, Nikan said finally, accepting the inevitable with the understanding that these women had earned the right to continue the fight they'd begun. No heroic gestures, no unnecessary risks. We do this carefully and legally, using the system rather than fighting it directly. They departed within the hour, 3 riders heading south toward mining country, where fortunes were extracted from the earth at costs measured in broken bodies and destroyed families. Harrison carried federal warrants authorizing investigation of the mine owner's activities, legal authority that might prove worthless if local officials chose to ignore it. The situation would require diplomacy, determination, and possibly violence depending on how aggressively the mine owner defended his exploitation. Silver City revealed itself in late afternoon. A rough collection of buildings clustered around the mine entrance where ore carts moved on rails toward the crushing mills. Company guards patrolled with rifles, watching for any signs of labor organization or resistance to owner authority. Through the crude jail's narrow windows, Nikan could see men crowded into space designed for perhaps half their number. We need to speak with the mine owner, Harrison announced to the guards blocking the jail entrance. Federal business regarding allegations of labor law violations and unlawful imprisonment. Minutes later, Malcolm Prescott emerged, a man in his 50s who radiated the authority of someone accustomed to absolute control. His expensive suit contrasted sharply with the rough miner's clothing visible throughout the camp. Harrison presented his warrants while explaining the allegations. Prescott listened with expression of bored tolerance, clearly believing he could dismiss these concerns as easily as he'd dismissed previous complaints. "The men in my jail are there legally," Prescott replied with practiced confidence. "They destroyed company property during a violent riot. Local magistrate issued arrest warrants based on sworn testimony, procedures that conveniently result in you acquiring their land claims," Dorothea interjected, stepping forward despite Nikan's warning gesture. "We've seen this pattern before, Mr. Prescott. Powerful men using legal systems to disguise theft. It didn't work for James Caldwell, and it won't work for you." Prescott's eyes narrowed as he recognized the twins, his confident expression cracking slightly as he understood that his activities had attracted exactly the kind of attention he'd been trying to avoid. Before the confrontation could escalate, Marshal Brennan emerged with 6 additional deputies, having apparently anticipated resistance. "The territorial governor asked me to convey that his administration will no longer tolerate labor abuses. Your operation will be among the first subjected to comprehensive investigation." The gathered families erupted in celebration, as they recognized that power had finally shifted against the man who'd controlled their lives for years. As the imprisoned miners walked free, Nikan felt profound satisfaction watching justice emerge from coordinated institutional effort rather than individual heroism alone. That evening around a campfire, Nikan finally made his decision about Brennan's offer. He retrieved the telegram and looked at the marshal directly. "I'll accept your appointment," Nikan said. "But with conditions. I work cases involving vulnerable people facing corrupt power. My value is finding people who need help and making sure they receive it." Brennan smiled, apparently expecting exactly this response. "Welcome to permanent duty, Deputy Marshal Bitsui." As dawn approached and the campfire burned down to glowing embers, Nikan finally allowed himself to sleep, secure in the knowledge that the twins were safe. That corrupt power had been challenged successfully one more time, and that tomorrow would bring new opportunities to honor the promise he'd made, not just to two women but to the principle that justice must serve everyone or it served no one.
Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.